the wrong thing at team. That is the thing we saw Gary Payne originally. And on that note, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the nightcap of today's doubleheader with the Mike and David podcast. If you haven't checked out the previous episode that was shot earlier today, that was volume 10 of the E-Men inside the NYPD's emergency service unit with Dan Cohen. Now, it's interesting speaking with Dan because he's the first active E-cop I've interviewed. He's not with the NYPD anymore, but he's out in Suffolk County, and he's an E-Man out there. And he's been one for about 15 years now. He's had a full plate in his career, worked in Truck 2 in Harlem in the 90s, and of course has 5 townships that he has to supervise out there on the island. Does a great job, so it was good speaking with him. So for the nightcap, episode 165, we welcome an equally interesting guest, and that is my next guest, who enjoyed a lengthy and highly successful career in the New York City Police Department, whereas any cop who's worked in it will tell you the path is alike. Having joined the force in 1979, he joined just in time to notch the distinction of being a 4-decade cop of the department. He worked in the 70s, 80s, 90s, as well as 2000s. And if you want to get really technical, he worked not only in 4 different decades, but 2 different centuries and 2 different millenniums. So when he left the NYPD, he didn't necessarily leave policing. He spent 5 years as commissioner of the Yonkers Police Department. That's Eddie Hartnett, who we welcome tonight to the nightcap, episode 165 of the Mike and David podcast. Mr. Hartnett, welcome. How are you?
Good evening, Mike. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's April, so I'm confident in better weather around the corner. But I know this is the month of rain, and today has been rainy, although it stopped over here. So what are you going to do? At least it's not that cold anymore, so we'll take it.
Hey, Mike, that loop where you show all the different past interviewees, I tell you what, that's an impressive lineup. My goal tonight is to crack that lineup and try to get on that loop, man.
Well, thank you very much. I think you will. So early years, it's always the first question I go to. So where'd you grow up?
Grew up I was born in Brooklyn, lived there till I was 5 years old. Then my parents moved to Washington Heights. They were building superintendents, so wherever the work was, that's where they went. So we settled in Washington Heights when I was about 5. Went to grammar school in Incarnation, 175th and St. Nicholas Avenue. Lived there till after I came on the job. So I'm a Heights kid.
There you go. And shout out to all our friends in the live chat. Appreciate everybody tuning in. Alicia D is here. Raquel Pranzo and Lieutenant Peter Pranzo, retired out of street crime, of course, and an author. John Latanzio, retired E-Man out of Truck 3 in the Bronx. John will be on the show next week. Thank you, buddy. I appreciate your constant support of the show, and everybody else as well for your constant support of the show. And if you have a question for Eddie, submit it in the chat. I'll make sure that I get to it at some point. So the education, we'll focus on that. Cardinal Spellman High School as well as Fordham. Pivotal lessons learned in both, especially in Fordham, where you had your bachelor's in political science. But first, we'll start with Cardinal Spellman High School. Everybody has that one teacher, or even that one fellow student that has a profound impact on them. Who was that for you?
Yeah, it's interesting. Spellman, going to Spellman from Washington Heights was a trek. Most of the guys in our neighborhood went to Cardinal Hayes, Powell Memorial, All Hallows, Rice, closer schools. We and a couple other guys from Incarnation went to Spellman. So you had to take like a bus to get to a special bus. It was kind of a pain in the neck to get there. But it was a great school. It was it was challenging. I can't think of a certain Christian brother or lay person or nun that taught me that made any kind of like super impact. But just the place in general, it was discipline. There was a dean of discipline who was a lay person who kept us all in line, mostly by fear and some corporal punishment at times. But lessons learned there served me later in life, and that Catholic education throughout my whole life, going on to college and even my graduate degree is from a Catholic university. So that foundation, it reinforced by the values that I got from my parents, served me well, throughout my life, even today.
Eddie Hartnett's our guest tonight on the Mike to New Haven podcast. It's the second show of the day. It's a doubleheader. This is episode 165, retired NYPD chief as well as Yonkers police commissioner. So that being said, talking about your time in Fordham, it's interesting. I've had quite a few Fordham alumni on the show. You saw in the opening loop Amanda Farinacci, who's the press secretary with the fire department. She's a Fordham girl. Alice Gaynor's been on the show. Terry Monahan's been on the show, and they're Fordham alumni as well. The bachelor's in political science, given where your career has taken you into law enforcement, I'm curious, why that specific major?
It was. Sorry, I lost it there a little bit of your audio, Mike. But political science just seemed to gravitate towards it. It wasn't like a burning bush told me to take political science. Frankly, a lot of the other degrees didn't interest me much. Even though there's mandatory required courses, etc. in religion and philosophy and sociology and psychology, and they took all that. And you got a well-rounded education for them. It's a great school, even to this day. But I just seem to be gravitate towards that. I don't think I was trying to be an elected official someday. I was interested in government, and that was the closest thing I could get to that. I had no real dreams of becoming a police officer even at that point. So it just seemed to be a good fit for me.
So what prompted the interest in policing?
I had thought about it a while, but then you remember in the mid 70s, there was massive layoffs of cops and firemen. So we were saying, well, if you wanted to become a cop, it's too late now because they're laying off. They're never going to hire cops again for years and years. And then after 5 years, the budget crisis was coming to an end. We took the test in June of 1979. They were so desperate for cops that they put us through the academy by November of 79. Mm-hmm. The average police officer in a radio car then was, I think, 38 years old. There was no movement in the job. So it was a good time to get into the job because the job was in the process of changing. Women were coming on the job. Women were working in traditional male roles in the police department. I worked with some great women that came on. And sadly, a lot of them were not welcome very often, were not treated well. They're treated much better now, of course, by statute. But it was a great time to become a cop, and even some of those ladies, I'm sure, would say the same thing. But it just was a natural fit for me. I didn't say, oh my God, I'm staying here for 20 years. I took the job and said, I'll give it 2 years. I have a college degree. I'm not cocky, but I'm confident. I said, if this doesn't work out, I'll go somewhere else. I think it took me maybe a month to say that this is for me and I'm staying.
So getting on, at that point, we got three different, as I covered before, and I always ask this question to anybody who came on pre-merge. You got transit and you got housing. Did it, growing up in the Heights, did it matter to you which one you went to, or did you specifically want the city PD?
I wanted the city PD, and it was one test then. So when you took the test in June of 79, it was just for the NYPD. I had friends that went the transit route, and they did well. They loved it. I actually became friends later on with Jimmy O'Neill, who's probably the most shiny example of the transit police that went from rookie transit cop all the way to police commissioner. For me, it was just it was a great fit for the NYPD. I'm glad there wasn't that lottery later on where you kind of got thrown into any of the three departments. I mean, I wanted to be NYPD, and I'm glad the test was just for the NYPD.
Of course. Eddie Hartnett's our guest tonight. Of course, as I said, a retired NYPD chief and Yonkers police commissioner. Certainly happy to have him. Quick shout out again to the live chat. Howard Blank, retired NYPD Taru, who I really wanted to come on the show. Howard, quit ducking me. Come on the show, pal. I'm just kidding. Love you, Howard. Thank you for tuning in, brother. So that first precinct, back then we had NSUs back then. So what was your NSU originally?
My NSU was NSU 9. We worked out of the 5-2 precinct. We covered the 5-2, the 4-6, the 4-7, and the 5-0. We rarely went. I mean, my group rarely went to the 4-7 or the 5-0. We mostly went to the 4-6, which again we got there in May of 1980. It was before crack hit, but the 4-6 was probably even then known as the most violent square mile in the city. Regularly getting 70, 80 homicides a year. Great cops, great place to work, great place to learn. You saw a lot of bad things. You saw a lot of grinding poverty, hopelessness, despair, drugs, gangs, violence, and you didn't get immune to it, but you learned to deal with it. And it was a great kind of a laboratory to learn in.
Who was your field training officer back then?
My field training officer, actually, my buddy, my first partner in the job was Austin Francis Muldoon. Now, there's a police name. He went by Tim Muldoon. Tim Muldoon and I were trained by a great man, Bill Clark, Detective Bill Clark, who we just had lunch with a few months ago. He's still around. He's still kicking. He's a great guy. Big, solid, burly guy. But, he taught us well. He taught us that you don't have to fight your way out of everything. Try not to fight your way at all. Try to use words. Bill Clark was teaching de-escalation before it became fashionable. A great man, and we benefited well from working with Bill Clark.
Now, if we're thinking of the same Bill Clark, and tell me if it's not, or if it is he one of the guys that ended up creating NYPD Blue?
No. Different. My Bill Clark is much better looking.
All right, different Bill Clark, because I know that Bill Clark was also a detective,
Yep.
but I believe he worked primarily in Brooklyn. Now, Pranzo mentions in the chat that you were, he says, young Eddie was one of the finest of the 3-2. You did make your way to the 3-2 at some point in your career. Was that where you went immediately after the NSU?
No, it's funny. It's the low point of my career probably, and it's really nobody's fault. But after we got out of NSU, the next class comes out. So right then you leave NSU and you go to a precinct. So the orders come down, and everybody else is going to a precinct, and I'm not on any of the orders. So I'm thinking, how could they forget me? Well, of course, a separate set of orders comes down, and 10 people out of our 400 the graduates of our rookie class, 10 people get selected to go to the Manhattan traffic area. So I get shipped down to Manhattan to direct traffic and write parking tickets. I was not a happy camper. My partner and I at the time, Barry Laddig, good man, he's just retiring after 20 years in the Board of Education Investigative Unit. So he's done 20 years in NYPD, 20 years there. So very proud of Barry and congratulating him on his retirement. Barry and I get there with 8 of our other classmates, and I learned a valuable lesson. We basically said, we're not rebels or rabble rousers, but we basically said, we don't want to be here, and we're going to do whatever we can to get out of here. And the valuable lesson we learned was the ones that make the most noise get kept the longest. So Barry and I wound up suffering there for a year and a half, and then they finally released us. Barry went to the 9th precinct, and I went to the 3-2. I was putting in transfer requests every month, and luckily for me, of all the requests I put in, they sent me to the 3-2. I think somebody thought, well, we'll screw this guy. You know, he's made a lot of noise, and now we're going to send him to Harlem. Best thing that could have happened to me. I worked with great people like Pete Pranzo, who looked after us when he was a sergeant there, and many others. Again, a little different than the 4-6, but many of the same conditions. You know, a lot of drugs, a lot of violence, a lot of great cops. Sadly, the 2 officers that just got killed right down the block from the 3-2 station house, you know, really impacted us even more because we're 3-2 alumni.
Yeah, and once you're a member of precinct or a specialized unit in the PD, you're always going to be a member. It never leaves you. You know, I'm sure Pete Pranzo feels that way. John Latanzio, retired E-man, he feels that way. Once an E-man, always an E-man. You know, it's always a part of you, even if you retired, I should say, years ago. So working there, I mean, I hate to say it, in such a neighborhood where all that's going on, as I've covered before, if you want to be a fireman, you don't work where there's no fire. If you want to be a defective cop, you don't work where there's really no crime. That's really, precincts like that are the best commands and have bred some of the greatest cops the city's ever seen.
Yeah, one of the best cops I worked with in the 3-2, and I think Pete Pranzo would back me up on this, would be the late Gene Mullahy. And probably Lou Anemone mentioned him because they were inseparable. Anemone and Mullahy were fast friends, best friends. But guys like Gene looked after you, you know, told you right, told you wrong. It was, you know, almost policing ourselves. I mean, we had good sergeants, but guys like Gene looked out for you, gave you good advice, told you when you stepped out of line. I didn't really step out of line much, thank God, but, you know, we had guys like that and great plainclothes anti-crime cops. I mean, thankfully, I was my partner then was Brian Murphy, one of the best cops I've ever worked with, who went on to bigger and better things in the Narcotics Division and in the DEA task force. We strove to get into the anti-crime unit, the plainclothes anti-crime unit, and after hard work and some luck and a sergeant that liked us, we got into the anti-crime unit. I think we were pretty effective. Even back then, there was no CompStat, so we thought we were doing a great job, but you know, there was no focus coming from the hierarchy of the department at the time. So we're out there running around, chasing people, but nobody, you know, in the higher ranks was keeping track of robberies, burglaries, you know, shootings, looking at the stats. Nobody did that until Bill Bratton came along and basically let the cops be cops again.
Right. Bill Bratton, Jack Maple, Lou Anemone, that team in the mid-'90s. So, you know, at that time, it's funny because earlier today in the first show, the doubleheader was Danny Cohen, like I mentioned, and before he went to ESU, he was a street crime cop, right before street crime got done away with in the late 90s, early aughts. And we talked about operating in stealth mode because if you're in an anti-crime or a street crime detail, as Lieutenant Pranzo can attest to, you're not answering the radio unless it's something really, really, really urgent, where it's, you know, everybody goes, like a 1013, for example. You're staying back and you're observing. And we talked earlier about sharpening those instincts as a cop, especially as a street cop, I should say. Can't speak today. So tell me about that time, I guess, and those observations kicking in, knowing what to look for, and really learning the neighborhood to benefit you.
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of this came out actually, sadly, in the controversy of the stop and frisk, which we'll probably get into later. But uh, the the willy nilly just frisking people just for the sake of tossing people is not good police work. It never has been. So to your point, observing a corner, a corner where there's been shootings in the past, a corner where maybe cops have been hurt in the past, or a corner where there's some robberies happening, where there's chain snatches or armed robberies of commercial locations. Watching people on those corners and then seeing how they react to us, even though we're say in a plainclothes car, unmarked car in plain clothes, very often the criminal element in the neighborhood knows the car, knows who we are, knows what we look like. So seeing their reaction to us would often trigger maybe raising it now from a mere suspicion situation to a reasonable suspicion situation. So then you might look further and see these, when you're carrying a gun, when the guys are carrying a gun, they tend to touch it a lot. So they'll put their hand near their waist. They'll have a heavy pocket if they have a coat on. They'll look around. They'll look over their shoulder a lot, especially if they're in a car, in the back seat of a car, like a gypsy cab, which gypsy cab drivers were getting killed at alarming rates back then. We stopped a lot of gypsy cabs and probably prevented some robberies and maybe even some shootings because the guy in the back seat probably had no intention of paying the fare and also was going to rob the guy. So those kind of instincts kick in and you learn more. It's all, it's like, it's almost by osmosis. You're working with good cops. Some of that stuff is going to rub off on you.
Oftentimes it's been said, not just in police work, but in other aspects of life, if you want to understand blank, you got to think like blank. And in this case, we'll take bad guys into account. If you want to understand a bad guy, you got to, in some aspects, think like a bad guy. Did you ever find yourself doing that well in anti-crime?
Yeah, actually, and again, the neighborhood back then, I mean, the 3-2 precinct now has gotten somewhat gentrified. I mean, all the buildings, fine.
All of New York pretty much.
Buildings. Sorry?
All of New York pretty much has gotten gentrified.
Yeah, but back in the early 80s, a lot of the buildings were abandoned.
Yeah.
So we spent a lot of time going through garbage-strewn backyards, climbing into windows of broken, abandoned buildings, climbing up fire escapes to view where guys are going to stash drugs, stash a gun. And we would often run into those guys in the same buildings as us. They were doing some counter surveillance on us. So you do start to think like bad guys. And thankfully, we are usually one step ahead of them, but not always.
Yeah. I mean, it's a constant battle. And it's a battle that's important. If you have a crime rate that's down, as we saw in the mid-'90s when CompStat came into play, it's a battle that you're winning. You're never going to get it down to zero. We don't live in a perfect world. But if you can get it down to a tolerable level, well, then you know what? It's a battle that you're taking home most of the victories in. It's kind of like a best of 7. You can lose 3 games in that series, but if you win the 4th one, hey, you move on. So there you go. A couple more shout outs in the chat. Michelina Sereno is here. Thank you, Michelina, for being here. I appreciate you as always. And like I said, if you have a question for Ed, fire away in the chat. So, I guess that brings us to your ascent through the ranks. If you come on the PD or the FD and you stay your entire career as a patrolman or a fireman in a given house, you can have a great, fulfilling career because there's a lot to do in New York City. There's nothing wrong with that, but some people really want to move up, because there's plenty to do there as well. When did the idea of, wow, I can be a sergeant, I can be a lieutenant, when did that first kick in for you?
It's funny. I had no family in the job. So, I mean, it sounds naive, but I when I first came on and it get to a precinct, whatever like that, I saw sergeants. I thought sergeants came on the job as sergeants. I had no idea how they became sergeants. So then somebody said, no, you have to take a test. And I said, well, I'm not Einstein, but if you give me enough time and you give me the material, I'll study it. I have a good education, a good background in education. So, I mean, I may not be number 1 on the list, but I'll get on that list somewhere. So, as luck would have it, I passed the 3 exams, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, because I put the time in. I mean, there was a lot of guys that said they were studying, they weren't. A lot of my contemporaries, we said, we may not ace this test, but we're gonna put the time in, go to classes to learn how to take the test, and read all the prep materials, and it worked out.
Getting through the ranks, especially that first promotion to a position like sergeant in the NYPD, it's not like you just step in and say, I'm a sergeant and this is how things are going to go. If you do that, you're not going to last very long as a boss. Oftentimes you have that senior cop in the precinct that's seen a thing or two. And even if they haven't been promoted officially, that seniority that they hold for their time on the job is good enough. did you find yourself relying and gravitating towards that senior cop to better help you be a boss and understand the personalities you had under you?
Absolutely. Very often that guy, and back then it was always a guy. It wasn't a woman.
Hmm.
That's just the way the job was then.
Right.
That guy would almost always drive a sergeant. So I got to the 4-8 precinct. I did 6 months there. There was this is 1985. There was a sergeant's operator. I hated the term chauffeur. They used to use the term chauffeur. To me, it was a distasteful term for a cop driving a sergeant. But the sergeant's operator in my particular squad was a guy named Bob Roach, the late Bob Roach. He passed away several years ago. But Bob was 60 years old. He got to that precinct in 1949, and now it's 1985. That was the only command he ever worked in. So Bob was literally the guy who knew how to turn the lights on. He was the corporate memory of the precinct and the confines of the precinct and the various blocks in the precinct. So riding around for a few months with Bob Roach taught me a lot about how to be a sergeant. Plus, he looked kind of old and I looked very young. So he would tell people that I was his son. So even though we had different nameplates, but learning from a guy like Bob, and there were others too, but Bob always comes to mind.
I mean, Mike, and that's an NYPD lifer. Think about it: the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. He'd seen it all.
Yeah, he had certainly seen it all.
My goodness. So there's so many hats that a boss wears. It's not just the command presence and coordinating operations. Sometimes you're a therapist. Sometimes you're a marriage counselor. Sometimes you're like a father figure. In terms of, we talked earlier just now with the previous question I asked about managing personalities. Once you found your footing a little bit in your own right and started to get comfortable as a boss, what was the key to being basically an accessible individual that your cops felt that they could trust?
I think a lot of it is, and I told my cops and my bosses later on when I came up through the ranks is, you got to be out there with your people. I had a lot of sergeants over the years, good sergeants, but there was some every now and then that, their whole thing was, I'll be in the station house, call me if you need me, but you better not need me. So you kind of left to your own devices out there. So you don't need to be, especially when you're a sergeant, that first line supervisor, you don't need to be on their back the whole time, breathing down their neck. But you got to be out there with them. You got to be showing them that you can do. You're not just going to tell them to do stuff. You're going to be with them. You're going to provide them with an environment of training, guidance, and support. I mean, most cops will never tell you, I love supervision. But down deep, they like to know that their boss is out there with them and going through everything that they're going through and seeing what they're doing and handling the things that they're handling and being there for them when they need them and not having to call them and make an appointment to have the sergeant come out to meet you.
Right. Are you a desk jockey or are you a crime fighter? It's a simple question. And, it's not answered verbally. Anybody can say, I'm a crime fighter, but actions speak louder than words. And it's important because if they don't say anything to your face, they're definitely talking about it behind your back, good, bad, or indifferent. Yeah, that sergeant, he's no good, man. He never comes out with us. He don't know what it's like to be on the street, or the opposite of what you just talked about. He's good people. I know if I was ever in a jam, he'd have my back.
And a lot of it to me would always revolve around officer safety. When you're on the scene or something, you don't have to break their chops, but you tell, especially young officers, you tell them, this block is hot. We've had problems on this block before. Look up when you're walking into a building because they're going to throw something down on top of your head. Stand under the fire escape if you have to stand out there in like the time. So something coming off the roof, airmail as we call it, doesn't hit you on the head.
Yeah.
Going up into a building, the family dispute or the ambulance case on the 4th floor. But there's a bunch of guys on the 2nd floor that don't know you're coming. And now you're going to surprise them. So turn your radio down so they don't hear it. Keep your hand off the banister so they don't see your blue sleeve going up. When they look down, they see your blue sleeve coming up. All those little tips that I was taught by guys like Bill Clark, I would want to pass on to them to make sure they got home at night.
Right. And it's an important thing. And the title airmail is funny, but the incident itself is not, because you remember what happened to poor John Williamson. I've referenced him before. He was a housing cop. 1993, October of 93, there was someone arrested in a neighborhood. A Dominican individual tossed some spackle off the roof as John was getting in his patrol car, and he was hit and he was killed. So, these are certain things that can cost you your life. I think Anthony McLean, another housing cop, he was looking for a missing girl. It was in a completely unrelated thing. He stumbled upon a drug deal in progress. Gunfire erupted. He was killed. So these are little things that unfortunately have been taught in blood, either through cops getting hurt or in the cases of McLean and Williamson, cops getting killed.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I guess that brings us to your first command, Drug Enforcement Task Force, 1995. to 1997. And what's interesting about that is when you're taking it over, it's right around the time the merge happened. So whatever transit talent that was good at taking drugs off the subways, maybe you're getting. Some whatever housing talent was good at taking drugs out of the projects, you're getting. So if the influx of new talent happened in the Drug Enforcement Task Force, how hard or maybe even how easy was it to best use the talents and best organize the structure of your personnel?
The DEA task force, again, I had a Manhattan South Narcotics Command before that, which was strictly, well, it was a buy and bust command, did a lot of search warrants, did some major case work. When you get to the DEA task force, and trust me, I was not the best narcotics investigator, but at the time, the chief of Narcotics Division at the time was a great gentleman named Pat Hartnett, a different spelling than my name. They thought he's my uncle. He wasn't, but he treated me like a nephew. Pat Hartnett had some confidence in me as a pretty much a baby captain to put me to represent the NYPD in the tri-agency DEA task force, which is the New York State Police, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the NYPD. John Timoney, the late great John Timoney, signed off on that. So that's the varsity of the Narcotics Division. I mean, aside from all the glitz and glamour and take-home cars and all the resources you need and working in a nice federal building, real narcotics investigators get to do real deep down, exciting narcotics work. I mean, everything from, violent home invasion, drug gangs to Cali and Medellin and Mexican cartels and everything in between. Money laundering. It's an amazing place to work. And again, the three agencies are all kind of thrust together. NYPD was probably at the forefront most of the time because it's our city. We know the area, we know the streets, we know the conditions better than the other two agencies. But we all mesh together very well for the most part. There was a little friction every now and then, and we have sharp elbows when we have to. But by and large, it was a great place to work. My 2 years there, I was lucky enough to get promoted to deputy inspector while I was there, and that's based on the hard work of detectives, sergeants, and lieutenants that were there with me.
When you look back, I mean, this was only 2 years, but it's still a very, very hectic period because not only is the merger happening, but broken windows is taking full effect. So there's more of an emphasis on targeting crimes of this nature. What are some of the more notable investigations you can recall?
Oh God, I mean, a lot of them. It's funny. I seem like every week I was signing travel paperwork for guys, and they weren't going to Bermuda. I think maybe they did go to Bermuda, but if they did, they were following a case there. Mm-hmm. But I had guys actually go to Guantanamo to monitor ships coming in. I had guys going back and forth to, following tractor trailer loads of weed and cocaine across the country. We had cases where we stopped a shipment of, and again, based on various investigative techniques, stopped a shipment of canned tomatoes. And I'm looking at this tractor trailer load of canned tomatoes, and I'm like, what are we doing here? And we get an industrial can opener set up, and there was, I think, $500,000 secreted in tomatoes that were professionally sealed with lead around, so you couldn't. We X-rayed them, couldn't see anything. Opened them up, and there's almost $500,000 in. So the cases came fast and furious like that. I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kilos of cocaine seized at any given time. Amazing work, and still, it also gave you some perspective because this is what we were seizing. What was getting through. Amazing how much drugs were and still are coming into this country. The fentanyl thing now is a crisis that I don't think, not to digress, I don't think that enough attention is being paid to. But getting back to the DETF, outstanding work. We did also case. I mentioned the home invasion gangs. I mean, these are some of the most vicious, violent sociopaths I've ever seen in my entire career. These guys would raid apartments, and granted, sometimes there would be drugs in these apartments. Sometimes they'd be in the wrong apartment, and they would start torturing people to make them give up where they were. I mean, medieval stuff, holding babies out windows, curling irons under people's armpits. I mean, all kinds of crazy stuff to get people to talk. So it was very, very rewarding that we would actually set these groups up, tell them where cocaine was stashed in a warehouse, etc. And they'd break in and they'd be like, "Surprise, guys, we're here." And taking those guys down and putting them away was to me one of the best things I was ever involved in my whole career.
Because criminals like that have no conscience. I mean, there's at least, I'm not going to say there's honor amongst thieves. It's a bit too strong, but at least there's a line where, okay, we don't target elderly people, we don't target women, we don't target children. They don't care. If there's money to be made and a quick check to cash, they'll do it. It doesn't matter who they hurt. And people like that are really the true scum of society.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So 1997, after an eventful 2 years there, now you go out to the 109 in Queens, and you had that a couple years, 1997 to 1999. Now, running a precinct is interesting because we talked earlier about conditions. And now it's not just narcotics. Now, okay, what if robberies are up? What if gun crime is up? It's so much to have to monitor. And now you have to learn it because the cops that have been there a long time, kind of like you talked about Officer Roach earlier, they know it better than anybody. And you have to go to them, and they're your source of intel. What was the makeup of the 109 at the time, and what did you specifically want to address when you got there?
The 109 is an interesting place. I'd never worked in Queens before, so I didn't know what to expect. I mean, back then in the 90s too, the kind of unwritten philosophy in the NYPD was you're not gonna rise up through the ranks unless somewhere in your career you've had a precinct, you've had precinct command. So I wanted a precinct anyway. So after I got promoted in the DTF, the clock was ticking. Went up into 109. I was already a deputy inspector, so at that rank, they're going to give you a bigger command. So the 109 is probably still the largest residential population in the city as far as number of people living in an area. It's 13 square miles. I still know. Back then, it had allegedly 220,000 people. I would say it was at least 300,000. I got to know them all by their first name when I was done. But it was a cool place to work. But it had everything. It was downtown Flushing. Is a large Asian population, primarily Chinese and Korean. And then there's various neighborhoods. They're almost like towns. You have Whitestone, you have Flushing, you have College Point. The precinct covers both bridges, the Whitestone and the Throgs Neck, all the way down to the Cross Bronx. It goes to the Flushing River just short of City Field, and it goes out to Francis Lewis Boulevard, if anybody knows Queens. It's a big area. And again, I didn't know Queens at all. So I relied heavily on like my community affairs people, my anti-crime people, lieutenants and sergeants. I worked with some great people there. There's a knock on Queens cops sometimes. They say, oh, well, you're going to work with the Queens Marines. I had a lot of respect for those cops out there because it wasn't maybe the most violent place, but it was a lot of volume. And they handle a lot of jobs. They handle a lot of radio runs. They handle everything. And we didn't have as many cops as we probably should have had because, again, the city had to put cops maybe where there was more violence, but a lot of respect for the 109 cops.
I mean, even sometimes Staten Island gets a knock, and we don't know what's going on in Staten Island. You don't know until you work in that borough. Like sometimes that's the joke that, I'll always bring this up. Mike Logan from Law and Order, when he punched that guy out at the end of season 5, he got banished to Staten Island. Well, what if he got to do a lot of work out there? You don't know what's going on out there, so you can't knock it until you've been there.
Yeah, and the 109 too for me was I mean, I'd been to CompStat. Compstat had just started maybe a year or two earlier. So, but now it was my turn at the podium. Now I had to get up initially in front of Lou Anamone. Now Chief Anamone was a 3-2 veteran also. So guys would say, and I knew him, and I knew him when he was a baby captain in the 3-2. But guys would say, oh, he's going to go easy on you, Hartnett, because you're a 3-2 guy. He knows you. I said, don't kid yourself, man. Lou Animal's going to expect more out of me because I'm a 3-2 guy.
Right.
So I had to be really on my toes when I went to the podium with him. And most of the time I ducked most of the punches, but you never leave totally unscathed.
I've heard stories of those mid-90s CompStat meetings. If you could survive those, you could survive anything.
Listen, if you had better lighting, I'd show some of the scars. But
John Latanzio in the chat, to my point earlier about Staten Island, he says Richmond County Sheriff's Office was the joke. So I'm sure you've heard that one. Besides the Queens Marines ones, that one's been thrown out there too a couple times. So there you go. But I guess that brings us to 99. And, you bounced around, I guess before I get to the Quality Assurance Division, you bounced around to 3 different commands in 5 years, all great commands, all great things to do. I mean, even though it's good to move on up, as they say, did the lack of stability, for lack of a better way to word the question, bother you at all? Or were you content moving around and experiencing different things?
I was content, but I wasn't unhappy. Like I did, 2 years in the 109. I could have done 3 years or 4 years there. I liked it there. I like the work. I like the cops. I like the community. I put on 10 pounds because there's so many different places that people want you to come and eat, and different functions. So I had to get that off after I left. But no, I enjoyed back then too. It seemed like 2 years, 3 years was they were moving commanders a lot. I think it's changed a bit since then. But again, I don't regret anything in my career. It's been glorious.
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. As we're chronicling tonight. And it's funny about the Quality Assurance Division. When I had my friend Rick Van Leuven on a little while ago, he worked at that division a little bit for a short period of time in his career once he had made sergeant. And it's funny because when we are calling somewhere, some corporation, it usually says this call may be monitored for quality assurance. So I said, what is that? Why does the NYPD have it? And he did a great job of explaining it. It really is one of the more unique units in the NYPD of the scope of what you get to do. It's more like a more sophisticated version of conditions.
It's amazing. I think of an analogy like when you're a little kid and maybe like in my era, like if you were not feeling well, you'd have a big tablespoon of like castor oil, and you'd be told, your mom would say, it's good for you. It's horrible. It's uncomfortable, but it's good for you. And that was kind of my time of quality assurance. I mean, the Commissioner Safer called me down at the time, and he said, the first deputy commissioner, Pat Kelleher, a great man, picked me to be the head of quality assurance. He wanted a precinct commander there because a lot of what we did involved precincts and especially crime classification. Some commanders were getting in trouble because they were fudging their numbers and cooking their books. So they wanted somebody there that actually had been there and done that. So it was an honor to get picked. I got promoted to full inspector at the time. And I tell you what, I did a year and a half there, and like somebody said, no little kid, 5-year-old kid, like one kid says he wants to be an astronaut, another kid wants to be a fireman. No little kid ever said I want to be the CEO of quality assurance. But I tell you what, it served me well later in my career in NYPD and even in Yonkers, because the NYPD measures everything. They count everything. They measure everything. There's metrics for everything. So we expanded on some of the stuff that they were looking at. And I mean, if they buy a helicopter or a box of paper clips, somebody's measuring that. And again, is it exciting work? Is it fascinating work? No, but it gives you an idea of how a police department should be run. And I again, looking back, it's nice to have it in your rearview mirror, but looking back, it served me very well.
And something, as I mentioned to Sergeant Van Leuven when he was on, and shout out to Rick, because I know he's watching tonight, it is an underrated and pivotal cog in a vast and large machine. You need it.
It really is. And the folks there are unique. Listen, they're like the old saying, you might not want to share a foxhole with some of them, but they're the best at what they do. And I learned an awful lot from them. Some of them were, I'm sure later after quality assurance, after their time in the NYPD was up, I'm sure a lot of them got picked up in accounting firms and, maybe some banking firms, because these people were top notch at what they did.
Right. I want to spend some time on the Intelligence Division, which you got to be in from 2000 to 2002, because you were right there when 9/11 happened and the shift went from standard intelligence on street level criminals or organized crime to counterterrorism measures. But first, before I get to the counterterrorism aspect of it, just getting there in 2000 and getting a look at just what the NYPD was monitoring and the scope of intelligence throughout the 5 boroughs. How much of an eye-opener was that for you?
Very much so. Commissioner Kerry called me in one day and said, and NEPC calls you in. They don't say, how would you like to go here? They just say, you're going here. So in this case, it was very good. Eventually got me promoted to deputy chief. Intel Division is almost in some ways a misnomer. I mean, they do a lot of stuff. A lot of dignitary protection. So there's all that stuff. Every time the president or anybody else came to town, I was probably in the command car, two cars ahead of the limo. Fascinating, interesting stuff. I mean, anybody who came into town, like I said, we were there. But they did a lot of behind the scenes stuff too. They did a lot of stuff. Stuff I'm probably still sworn to secrecy about, but a lot of, in a legal way, monitoring certain groups. Again, this is before 9/11. But every 90 days, I had to go in to the Deputy Commissioner of Legal Matters and justify every one of those investigations based on the handshoe case from years earlier, which basically, NYPD, years earlier got caught doing political monitoring that was probably not totally above board. So based on Hanshu, we had to go in every 90 days and basically justify keeping each case open. I had a 1,000% batting average with that, but we had to make sure all of our T's were crossed and our I's were dotted. And then while I was there, we doubled the size of the division, and we formed a more robust criminal intel section, which is many aspects of it are still in place today, 20 years later. Every precinct now has a field intelligence officer. I'm happy to say I'm one of the parents. Success has many parents. I'm one of them. We put that in place. The FIOs that are out there now running around doing great work came from the Intel division back pre-2001. So they were everywhere. And then 9/11 hits, and then a lot of our mission changes.
And I'll touch on that right now, but quickly, because you mentioned dignitary protection. When UNGUD was going on every September, did you work any General Assemblies?
Oh yes.
Okay. All right. I don't envy poor, Mark Torrey from the Bomb Squad. He's a friend of ours. I don't envy that man's position at all, nor do I envy John Miller's position, because that is a lot to have to monitor.
Hey, listen, every UNGA, UN General Assembly, I got a cramp in my hand signing all their overtime slips. So
there you go. And especially imagine, 2001 when the World Series happened, and you had Bush coming in as well for that. I mean, that must have been a headache.
Well, one of the angriest crowds I've ever seen. And again, it was unfortunate, but at that World Series, the Secret Service, the president showing up, and the president has to throw out the first pitch and all that stuff. So there's a lot of pressure on him.
Right.
But there's a lot of pressure on us too, because everybody had to be screened going in. Mm-hmm. So there were people who were very upset because they didn't get to their seat until the third inning. And we got a lot of normally calm people yelling and screaming and cursing at us.
And it must have felt good because, we're back to normal. There you go. New York is.
Yeah, it did. And I'm a Yankee fan, so
there you go. And that night, those 3 games at the stadium were epic. And that night, I watched the game on YouTube. They won that game 2-1. Roger Clemens went 7 innings on 1 run and 9 strikeouts. Jorge Posada hit a home run. So right after that day, the mission changed. And I remember having John Cutter on this show. And he talked about it, and you work with John, and John's a friend of mine and a friend of yours as well. So being there when Ray Kelly comes in, and he brings David Cohen with him, who's an interesting guy from the CIA background, it changed the scope. Some might question some of the methods, but it worked because you were able to prevent another major attack in New York City. Seeing that firsthand, I mean, given the fact that the CIA is able to do things that most law enforcement agencies really can't do, did it feel kind of, I guess, for lack of a better way to ask the question, liberating, even though you already had enough leeway as it was to be able to do even more?
Yeah, when Commissioner Kelly came in, and again, it was no knock on me or my tenure at Intel, but usually when a new PC comes in, Intel is one of those positions where they change it out. PC wants his own Intel guy there. I totally got that. They treated me well, but Commissioner Kelly asked me to transition Commissioner Cohen in. So I got along well with Commissioner Cohen. He's a bit of a character. If you've met him, so I probably did 3 months with Dave Cohen, and I like to think he learned a lot from me, and I also learned a lot from him. But then they let me go back to the Narcotics Division. That's when I wound up back in where I started as a temporary undercover in Bronx Narcotics many years ago. But it was interesting to see, and I was happy to see how Intel expanded and really, listen, building on some of the foundation that was laid by me and many others before me and many others with me. It really took off. And again, now once you have a guy like Miller there, but Tom Galati's been there for years, and Tom is top-notch professional. A lot of the other people there, Joe Gallucci is another guy in counterterrorism. Guys like that, they know the business inside and out. So I was happy to be there, and I was happy to transition Commissioner Cohen in. The one regret, if I could digress a little bit, one regret is 9/11 hits, and again, the Intel division. I always say that not me so much, but there's a lot of unsung heroes there. A lot of people that never, and these guys weren't asking for credit, but these folks never were acknowledged for what they did, on and after 9/11. John Cutter led several hundred guys, and we ran down every single lead that the FBI couldn't handle. Nothing against the FBI, but they were swamped. So right. Anything that came up, somebody's looking out the window and they saw something suspicious, my guys investigated that. And with leadership from guys like John Cutter, it got done. On the other side of the house, all the guys that do other things, dignitary protection, etc. On 9/11, these guys commandeered boats. They did all stuff. They didn't ask permission. They didn't ask sergeants, get the sergeant over here. They did what they had to do to save people. And then they went home, every night and came back the next day. And sometimes they worked the pile. Sometimes they were doing dignitary protection. Sometimes they're doing whatever. But again, when all is said and done, and I knew they had to transition and build up the Intel division into a bureau, but it would have been nice somewhere along the way if someone had said, hey guys, job well done.
And there's the added motivation of who you owe it to. You owe it to everybody who was on those planes. You owe it to everybody that was in those towers, the 343 firemen, the 63 police officers, if you count courts and the Port Authority police. I know you knew some of the NYPD cops, the 23. You mentioned some of them from emergency service that you were friendly with. You owe it to them because at this point, not only are there no leads yet, or there's some leads, but there's no concrete information yet. They still haven't found so many of these individuals yet. They're still missing.
Yeah, and being down there that day when both towers come down, and again, I got stuck in a building. A lot of guys have, close call stories, shall we say.
Mm-hmm.
I'm there with my guys, and guys like Lieutenant Rich Lava, retired Lieutenant Rich Lava, who I spoke to today, still a good friend. We didn't know. They were saying that maybe more planes coming in. Right. And, lesser people would have said, let's get out of here. And they stayed.
They stayed. And they were willing to go down with the ship if need be. And those are, and they're even though they hate this term, and I understand why, but I'll use it anyway. Much to their chagrin, they're heroes. They wouldn't consider themselves as such, but that's heroic stuff to do, to stay there in the fight and not leave. So I guess going from, and I guess everything with narcotics in the Bronx borough and then the division itself blends together. You return there after a stint in Intel, and you're bringing so much of this newfound information with you. In that time, running the borough in the Bronx and then the division itself from 04 to 06, how much sharper did you feel, and how much that newfound information from that 2-year stint in Intel benefit the operation as a whole in narcotics?
Well, we had a lot more tools, and by tools, I'm including the whole CompStat process because now we were much more focused. Hey, listen, I love the Narcotics Division. I was in Narcotics Division, I think, in 4 or 5 different ranks in my career. But now, when I'm a chief there, running Bronx Narcotics, I had 550 personnel in the Bronx back then. I dwindled down quite a bit now, but I had teams all over the Bronx. I had a major case team. I had a school team. I had a housing team. They were out there, 3, 4, 5 days a week, just doing buy and bust, search warrants. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of search warrants, doors getting knocked down with bad guys behind them, and you're not always sure what's back there. We can't call emergency service for every search warrant we're doing because there's not enough emergency service guys. I mean, I love emergency service. My son is in emergency service.
Really?
But, oh yeah. So he's got 17 years on. My son Matt, he might be listening now. So hey, bud. But yeah, once I got back to narcotics, I saw that we had the tools, more tools to get the job done, technology wise, training wise. So it was a much more focused approach. And again, Pat Hartnett, my chief, instilled in us that geographic area responsibility. Like, this is your turf. You're responsible for all the kites, the narcotics complaints that come in this precinct. Do something about them. Don't just stamp them, for your information. Do something about them, because some person in that neighborhood took the time to call because they're desperate for help.
Right. And to your point about Matt Hartnett, not now, because the active guys, I know it's a little tricky for them. But when you retire, Matt, I want to get you on my show for the ESU miniseries. So the countdown's on, 3 years to 20. And then I'm going to give you a call, okay? I'm going to ask your dad for your number.
He's going to kill me.
Hope you're doing well, Matt. Thank you for what you do. So, accelerating ahead, 2006, you make an interesting transition from the job of the NYPD out to Yonkers. Now, it's 27 years. You did a lot, full plate in a career. You were not cheated at all. And you, as you said earlier, you had no regrets. And then going to Yonkers to become their police commissioner, this is a two-pronged question. First, the transition itself. I mean, maybe I'm underestimating it, and tell me if I am. You go from one police department to another in which it's basically the same, a patrol bureau, a detective bureau, an emergency service unit. And now you get to run it. The only thing that's different is the city it represents and maybe the patch on the side. Was that transition, given how close Yonkers is to the city and the amount of time you had worked in the Bronx, a relatively easy one?
Looking back, it was easier than I thought it would be. And it's funny because this job came up. I got a call. Again, I was the second in command of the Narcotics Division. I was a deputy chief for 4 or 5 years at the time. Very happy. Love the job. Love the department. Love what I'm doing. Proud of being with the men and women of the NYPD. And so I get a call and they said, hey, Mayor of Yonkers is looking for a police commissioner. And of course, I thought this guy wanted me to find some people for him to interview. And the guy says, no, knucklehead, he wants to talk to you. So, and I'm not being humble. That's just how it happened. So I immediately contact, again, Pat Hartnett, John Timoney. And I said, hey, because these guys are mentors to me. And I said, what do you think? I mean, I'm not looking to leave. And both of them didn't hesitate 1 second. They said, you got an opportunity to go run your own police department, go run your own police department. So that meant a lot to me, that they thought they had the confidence in me that I could do this. So I went there, and some folks say, oh, you got to bring somebody with you. You got to bring, maybe not an entourage, you got to bring some key people. And, I had one fellow in mind, a good friend, retired Sergeant Lenny Lemmer. He's out there somewhere now. Hopefully he's listening. He was the only guy I thought about maybe bringing. Lenny, he checks off a lot of boxes. He's an intel guy. He's a narcotics guy. He's a good street guy. Actually, I met Lenny in 1981. My uncle got mugged, and Lenny caught the guy that mugged my uncle. And then the guy decided to resist arrest, and Lenny was happy to oblige him. But you know what? Lenny couldn't do it at the time, and so I went myself. And it served me well. I went in. I asked a lot of questions. Good people there, good solid people. You mentioned they have their own detective division. Some of the best detectives I've ever worked with anywhere are Yonkers detectives. The emergency service unit, I got them some training, got them some equipment. Again, no disrespect to the E-men in New York, but I stacked the Yonkers ESU up to them close, if not equal. Great street cops. I had 4 precincts. It's like almost like 4 different towns in Yonkers. The 3rd precinct is a busy area with a lot of crime, a lot of social ills. Great cops all over Yonkers. But the 3rd precinct is a busy place, and those cops, they handle it well. So it was a good transition. And working directly for a mayor, it reminded me of being a precinct commander in some ways. Because one thing about being a precinct commander is you can put something in place and see a tangible result the following week. And I got gratification out of that. So now on a larger scale, I could do that in Yonkers. And again, with a lot of help from a lot of good people. It wasn't all me, but we could do things. And I could do things that in the past I might say, man, I wish somebody would do something about that. Well, now I could do something about that. And then I had control of a budget as well. And I had control of personnel. I had control of everything. And you know what? I didn't realize how much I would like that. And I did 5 years there, and I loved every minute of it.
And that pretty much answers the second leg of the question I was going to ask you, because so many times, more times often than not, in both the PD and the FD, the guys on the ground, or the gals on the ground too, are saying, man, I wish the job would change this. I wish the job would do something about that. And as you said, now you're in a position where, wait a minute, I've always wanted to do this. Now I can. And, maybe it could be that other police departments, including the one that you had retired from in 2006, were looking at what you were doing and saying, you know what, he's on to something. Maybe we could try that here.
Yeah, it's interesting because there was some of the Yonkers guys complained to City Hall. They said, this guy Hartnett, he came here with everything comes out of the NYPD playbook. And so then Deputy Mayor, good guy, called me up and said, hey, he's got this complaint. I said, it's a good playbook. I said, I don't take everything out of it. I said, I just take the things that I think work. Like, for example, I brought CompStat to Yonkers. But I said, you know what? It wasn't like the mid-90s where you had to do like Bratton and Anemone and Timoney and Maple had to come in and basically turn this enormous battleship around. Yonkers, my CompStat was more, shall we say, collegial. I did it once a month. I told people, however you dress for work, come to CompStat like that. Be ready to talk about whatever you do. They adapted well to it. They took to it. It was fine. I was on the discipline side. I thought sometimes, obviously you need discipline, but at times I thought the NYPD discipline was somewhat draconian, somewhat severe. Listen, I think the discipline I laid on folks in Yonkers at times, thankfully not too much, was a little more harsh than what they were used to, but it certainly was not the what I thought was sometimes the extreme the discipline that was exhibited in the NYPD at times. So, I mean, but, by and large, I said, I took what I learned best from the NYPD. I brought it in with me. I had a great number 2 there, the Chuck Gardner, who did 5 years with me, put up with all my madness. Luckily for Chuck, when my mayor left with term limits and I was leaving, me and many others recommended Chuck Gardner to be police commissioner, and the incoming mayor took Chuck, made him the PC, and Chuck was there 7 years. Now, one of my former lieutenants and captains, John Muller, is there. John's doing great work up there as well. I think I like to say we pass it on. I build on what I had. Chuck built on what he had, what he got from me, and now John is building on what Chuck and I left behind. And I'm sure when John leaves, he's going to leave a good legacy behind, and now something more to build on. And listen, you don't spike the football, but you say, hey, here's what I've got done. Now take that ball and run with it.
I kind of liken it to when Joe Montana left the 49ers and Steve Young came in. Well, he'll never be as good as Montana. He's not trying to be, but he's got a great team around him. He's trying to make the most of it. If you got Jerry Rice there, you got Deion Sanders there, capitalize, do some things that maybe are not the same as your predecessor, but as you said, can be done in a way and implemented in a way that is alike to where you came from, but your own positive spin on it.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a good analogy. I've never been compared to Joe Montana, but I love it.
You're quite welcome. So 2011 comes around, and you're having a lot of fun. You just talked about it. 5 great years in that position, 32 years overall in law enforcement, and you retire. Was it a moment of just saying, I've done everything I've wanted to do. I feel so fulfilled. Let me take on a new challenge? Or what other factors led you to say in 2011, you know what, time to go?
Yeah, again, the mayor Amicone, Phil Amicone, great mayor. It's funny, when he said he was term limited out, he was leaving. They made overtures. Oh, you could put in for the job and stay, and I wasn't going to stay. He brought me to the dance, so I'm going home with him. But at the time, I said, well, maybe I still don't have the police bug out of my system yet. So I did interview in a couple of places. I interviewed for the police chief job in West Palm Beach, Florida. I made the finals, and then I withdrew my name because I think my family didn't want me to relocate down to Florida. So, but then thankfully I still got a bit of a police fix because I wound up doing some police consulting projects with Bill Bratton. Very, very fortunate that he chose me to be on some of these teams. And one thing about police consulting is you don't go to exotic places like Bermuda. You go to Detroit. So we did projects in Detroit, Oakland. We just finished one a few months ago in St. Louis. We did Baltimore, South Central LA. So, it helped me kind of transition out of policing because I was still doing, something with cops. And I got to say, that work is very rewarding, very fulfilling. And cops are great. Cops, I don't care where they are. Cops in Detroit, I bond with them. I rode around Oakland with the police sergeant, police lieutenant. Cops are cops, and I love cops.
Yeah, I want to do a ride along someday. I got to see if I can do a ride along. I was talking to one of the E-men off the air. That if I could square it up with the fine folks down at DCBI to come down and just ride for a day and just see what it's like and see the great work that's done day in and day out. It'd be very, very cool. Maybe my mom would have some reservations about it, so I'd have to convince her. But if we're able to get past that barrier, hopefully that's something I can get done.
And then get your body camera.
Get my body camera, or this, because this is quite helpful these days as well. So this has been a great conversation. And now comes the concluding segment, which is rapid fire. 5 hit and run questions from me, 5 answers from you. You can say pass if you want to. Are you ready?
Is there a door prize or anything? Or
No, I don't have the budget for that yet. I have to get my money up. Here we go. The first, and this is why I say you can say pass in the event it's not G-rated. Funniest call you ever responded to?
Oh, I don't know if it's ready for prime time, but we responded to a door one time, and there was a bit of an argument between a man and woman, and basically, one was accusing the other of having sexual relations with the family dog.
Ah, all right. Well, there you go. Only in New York.
We'll go on from there.
The second, best advice anyone ever gave you?
Get the facts before you act. And that's more for young sergeants. And again, I saw it firsthand when some guy came in late. Sergeant screamed at him, "How come you're late? How come you're late? How come you're late?" And turns out the guy's got a sick child at home. So get the facts before you act. Serves me well.
Absolutely. And anything in life. Third, if not for the NYPD, what other career could you have seen yourself pursuing and enjoying?
Well, center field for the Yankees was taken by some number 7. I always say, I wouldn't have been good at making widgets. I wouldn't have been good. I'm not a science guy. Maybe something in finance, in business. I wound up, doing okay in business after policing, but I can't imagine not being a cop.
And then, if it wasn't bad enough after number 7 left, some time passed and some number 51 came in and completely dashed all your hopes.
Wow. And how come they don't consider him as part of the core 4? I don't get
They
that.
should. It's really, I hate the core 4 moniker. It really is the core 5, as you said, and he was there first.
Absolutely.
He was there first, Bernie Williams.
Yeah, he was there first.
Great
Bernie gets a short shrift.
Yeah, burn, baby, burn. That's the old John Sterling home run call. Whenever he'd go.
That's right. That's right.
Fourth, favorite bar or restaurant in New York City?
It's gone now. Kennedy's on 57th Street and Coogan's on Broadway in Washington Heights. Both of them gone now. Both. Actually, I just heard today, Roy Bernard was the kind of manager in Kennedy's on 57th Street. I heard he just passed away today.
All right, my condolences.
A great man. And of course, Coogan's was Peter Walsh and Dave Hunt. They ran a great place, and sad that both of those traditional old-time New York places are long gone now.
I think Forlini's just closed down too.
Oh my God!
Yeah, it's another one, man. All these great places I'm never going to get a chance to visit whenever I go to the city. Fifth and
finally,
Harlem
cops. We couldn't afford Forlini's, but I've been there a couple times.
No, I don't. Like I said earlier, I have to get my money up, or I have to see if somebody will take me there on the arm. So that said, fifth and finally, if you can grab any one of these new guys or gals coming on the job at the graduation ceremony, right after they've done that hat toss up in the air, and give them some advice about the job, what would you tell them?
It's funny. I used to do a little lecture for rookies, and I wrote it as an article one time, the 5 police senses, and it's basic stuff, sense of awareness, sense of humor, common sense, a sense of self. But the 5th one, I would write on the board, MOM. And I'd say, what does this stand for? And they would say, method of madness or method of this and that. And I'd say, no, it's mom. Don't do anything. Simple stuff. Don't do anything that you wouldn't do if your mom was standing next to you. So,
my mother's going to love that. If she
listens to this episode. Whoever gave you your value system growing up, keep that in mind and you won't do anything wrong.
I'm going to try to send that clip to my mom because I know she, I'm going to get out ahead of it. I know she's going to love that particular part if she's listening.
Oh, regards to mom.
There you go. And you're right. You're absolutely right. So this was absolutely a blast. Stick around. We'll say goodbye off the air. Don't sign off yet. But before I say goodbye to the audience, any shout outs to anyone or anything that you want to give?
My lovely wife, Grace, my son, Matt, and of course, the lovely and talented Pete Pranzo.
Yes, shout out to Lieutenant Pranzo indeed. And shout out to everybody that tuned in tonight. Yeah, rather you were in the live chat or not, I appreciate it. So, of course, I'll go in order here. Raquel Pranzo, of course, is better half. Pete Pranzo's better half. Alicia B., as I mentioned before, John Latanzio, who will be on the show next Friday as part of my emergency service miniseries, Out of Truck 3. Great guy. Looking forward to speaking with him. He was here. Howard Blank out of Taru. He was here as well tonight. Thank you for tuning in, my friend. I appreciate your support of the show. Eddie O'Rourke is here. He says, Mike, great interview, Chief. Truly honored to have you as a friend. So thank you, Eddie, for tuning in tonight. Ruth Ann Griffin, Steve-O, thank you, everybody. Like I said.
And my granddaughters, Ava and Madeline.
Oh, shout out to them, too. Anybody that tuned in, thank you. I always appreciate the support of the show. Coming up next in the Mike Newhaven podcast, it is volume 15 of the Best of the Bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. He was an original member of the FDNY Special Operations Command when it was launched on July 1st, 1998. His name is Kevin Kugler. He spent 16 of his 19 years in the FD in Squad 288, and I look forward to interviewing him this Tuesday. So in the meantime, on behalf of retired NYPD Chief and Yonkers Police Commissioner Eddie Hartnett, I am Mike Colón. Have a great weekend, everybody. We will see you next time. Take care.
Thanks, Mike.